Hey everyone, tonight we're going back to one of history's saddest stories. This isn't about big armies or famous battles. This is about how a single plant, a simple flower, brought the world's strongest empire to its knees. Tonight, you'll learn how opium, from a beautiful poppy flower, destroyed China's greatest dynasty and changed world history forever. Before we begin, please like this video if you enjoy these calm nighttime history journeys. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's amazing to see our community come together from all over the world. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let the world fade away. Tonight, we explore how a flower, just a simple poppy, reshaped nations. We'll discover how a fight over tea turned into a drug war. How British traders became the world's biggest drug dealers. And how the effects of these wars still affect China today. This isn't just about war. It's about addiction, greed, two very different cultures clashing, and the terrible cost of empire building. By the end, you'll understand how one flower changed everything, and why China still calls this time, the century of shame. Picture yourself standing on the docks of Canton in the year 1800. This is the only Chinese port where foreigners can trade. The air smells like tea, silk, and spices. Ships from around the world wait in the harbor, ready to fill their holds with Chinese treasures. Above it all stands the most powerful, richest empire the world has ever known. China in 1800 wasn't just another country. It was the world's economic superpower. The Qing Dynasty ruled a territory bigger than modern Europe. It had 300 million people, almost a third of everyone alive. And China made more than 1/3 of everything produced on Earth. Think about that. One country making 1/3 of the world's goods. Today, that would be like combining the economies of America, Japan, and Germany into one massive superpower. The Chinese emperor wasn't just a king. He was called the Son of Heaven, the divine ruler of the Middle Kingdom, the center of all civilization. From his view, China was the world. Everything else was just barbarian lands on the edges. And looking at the facts, he had a point. European traders weren't partners. They were beggars, asking for the honor of buying Chinese goods. China had invented paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass. They made silk so fine you could see through it. Porcelain so delicate it seemed like magic. And tea so perfect that entire nations changed their daily routines just to drink it. But here's where trouble started to grow. The Chinese didn't want anything Europe had to offer. Nothing. European goods seemed crude, poor quality, unnecessary. When British merchants arrived with wool and manufactured items, Chinese officials basically said, "No thanks, we're fine." So how did trade work? Simple. Europeans brought silver. Mountains of silver. They'd sail halfway around the world, drop off chests of precious metal, and sail home with tea, silk, and porcelain. It was completely one-sided, and it was draining Europe dry. The British East India Company, the huge corporation controlling Britain's Asian trade, was losing silver fast. Every year, millions of pounds of precious metal flowed into China and never came back. The British treasury was being emptied. Something had to change. But the Chinese system seemed unbreakable. They had everything they needed. Their farming was advanced. Their craftsmen were the best in the world. Their population was huge and productive. They controlled the trade routes, set the prices, and made all the rules. Foreigners could only trade in Canton. Only through approved Chinese middlemen. And only by Chinese rules. The most powerful of these middlemen was a man named Hao. He was probably the richest person on the planet. His personal fortune was about $26 million, which equals billions today. This man literally had rooms filled with silver. During a fire in 1822, people saw rivers of melted silver flowing through the streets from his vaults. The Chinese system was called the Canton system. It was designed to keep foreigners at a distance while taking their money. Foreign merchants could only live in special areas outside the city walls called factories, not manufacturing plants, but trading houses. They couldn't bring wives or families. They couldn't learn Chinese. They couldn't travel into China. And most importantly, they could only trade through approved Chinese merchants. It was humiliating for Europeans, but it worked perfectly for China. The empire was stable, rich, and safe. The emperor received gifts from neighboring kingdoms. The people were fed and clothed. Chinese culture was thriving. Art, books, and philosophy were reaching new heights. It seemed like the Qing Dynasty would last forever. But a problem was brewing, one that would bring this entire system crashing down. The British had found something the Chinese wanted. Something that would reverse the flow of silver, create millions of addicts, and destroy the world's greatest empire. That something was opium. Opium wasn't new to China. It had been used as medicine for centuries, usually eaten or drunk to treat pain. But something changed when Europeans introduced smoking it. Suddenly, what had been medicine became something far more dangerous, a drug that created instant, powerful addiction. At first, opium smoking was only for the wealthy elite. Government officials, rich merchants, men of leisure. It was a luxury drug, a status symbol. But that was about to change in terrible ways. The British East India Company had huge opium farms in Bengal, what is now India and Bangladesh. They were making thousands of chests of the drug every year. And they had found the perfect market, China. The only problem? Opium was illegal in China, banned by the emperor. But when has something being illegal ever stopped merchants from making huge profits? By 1800, around 4,500 chests of opium were being smuggled into China every year. Each chest held about 140 pounds of the drug. That's over 600,000 pounds of opium flowing into China annually. And demand was growing fast. The Chinese government started to notice. Local officials reported increasing problems with addiction, especially among government workers and soldiers. Tax collection became difficult as more people spent their money on opium instead of paying the state. But the full size of the crisis was still hidden from the emperor in Beijing, thousands of miles from the southern ports where drugs entered the country. He thought this was just a small smuggling problem, not realizing a national disaster was building. They had no idea they were about to face the worst challenge in Chinese history. Not from armies or natural disasters, but from a simple flower that produced milky sap. A flower that would bring the celestial empire to its knees and change world power forever. Let's talk about opium itself, the innocent-looking flower that would destroy an empire. The opium poppy doesn't look threatening. It's actually beautiful, delicate petals in white, pink, or purple, swaying in the breeze. But hidden in its seed pod is a milky liquid that contains some of the most powerful drugs known to humans. When you cut the surface of an opium pod with a knife, white sap oozes out. As it dries, it turns brown and sticky, forming raw opium. This contains morphine, codeine, and dozens of other chemicals that can stop pain, cause intense pleasure, and create terrible addiction. For thousands of years, opium had been used as medicine. Ancient people called it the joy plant. Doctors gave it for everything from headaches to heartbreak. But it was always taken in small amounts, usually mixed with wine or eaten in tiny doses. The game changer was smoking. When opium is heated and the smoke inhaled, the drugs reach the brain in seconds, creating an intense immediate high that's far more powerful and addictive than eating it. And ironically, it was the Chinese who perfected this method, creating the very technique that would destroy their society. The process was almost like a ceremony. The opium was heated over a flame until it bubbled and released sweet, sharp smoke. This smoke was drawn through long pipes, often beautiful works of art with decorated metal bowls and stems. The user would lie on their side on a wooden platform, drawing the smoke deep into their lungs, then drifting into a dreamlike state for hours. The effects were seductive. 1 puff and your troubles faded. 2 puffs and you were floating in warm comfort. 3 puffs and you were in paradise. Or at least that's how it felt. The social damage was devastating. Imagine a society where many people are addicted to a drug that makes them unable to work. Fields went unplanted because farmers were too busy smoking opium. Workshops sat empty because craftsmen had sold their tools to buy drugs. Government offices were staffed by officials who spent their days in drug-induced stupors. Families were torn apart. Fathers sold their children's clothes to buy opium. Mothers pawned their wedding jewelry for one more pipe. Children went hungry while parents chased the dragon, the term for the perfect high that addicts spent their lives chasing but never quite reaching. The economic damage was just as bad. For centuries, silver had flowed into China as payment for Chinese goods. Now that silver was flowing back out to pay for opium. The Chinese economy, built on exporting goods and importing precious metals, was suddenly reversed. Instead of getting richer, China was bleeding wealth. Local officials tried to stop the trade, but they faced an impossible situation. Many of their own workers were addicted. The smugglers had more money than the government and could bribe officials at every level. And the demand was so huge that stopping supply seemed hopeless. The smuggling operations were smart and well organized. British ships would anchor at Lin Tin Island just outside Chinese waters. They'd transfer their cargo to fast Chinese boats that could outrun government patrol ships. These boats then distributed the opium to dealers throughout southern China, who sold it to a growing network of opium dens and private users. The British weren't just passive suppliers. They were actively promoting addiction. They hired Chinese agents to recruit new users, offering free samples to get people hooked. They funded opium dens and provided equipment and training. They even published guides on how to smoke opium most effectively. This wasn't just business. It was chemical warfare. The British had found a way to weaken Chinese society from within, to make the population dependent on a product only they could supply. Every new addict was a victory for British business and a defeat for Chinese civilization. The Chinese government was slow to see the full crisis. Reports from local officials were often ignored by the imperial court in Beijing. The emperor and his advisors were focused on traditional threats, rebellions, natural disasters, foreign invasions. They didn't understand they were facing something entirely new, a form of war that attacked not bodies but minds, not the state but the soul of their civilization. By 1830, the crisis had reached a breaking point. Around 2 million Chinese were regular opium users, and the number grew every day. The drug was no longer just in coastal regions. It was spreading inland along trade routes, carried by merchants, soldiers, and officials. The social fabric of Chinese society was unraveling. Traditional values of hard work, family loyalty, and respect for authority were being destroyed by a drug that made such values seem meaningless. The Confucian ideal of a harmonious society was being replaced by the chaos of mass addiction. Something had to be done. The question was what, and whether it was already too late to save the celestial empire from the flower destroying it from within. Chapter 3, The Drug Dealers in Suits. Now let's talk about the men who turned drug dealing into an art form. The British merchants who built fortunes on Chinese suffering and convinced themselves they were doing good. These weren't back-alley criminals. These were respectable businessmen, pillars of their communities back home. Men who went to church on Sundays and gave to charity while poisoning an entire civilization for profit. The most successful were William Jardine and James Matheson, two Scotsmen who would eventually found Jardine Matheson and Company, one of the most profitable drug smuggling operations in history. Jardine was a former ship's doctor who had seen opium's effects firsthand but decided profit was more important than medical ethics. Matheson was a calculating businessman who could make addiction sound like a public service. These men weren't just selling opium. They were revolutionizing the drug trade. They developed new smuggling techniques, faster ships, and more efficient distribution networks. They bribed officials, recruited local agents, and created a supply chain that could deliver opium to any corner of China within weeks. Their ships were marvels of engineering, designed specifically for the opium trade. Fast clipper ships that could outrun Chinese patrol boats, with hidden compartments for storing drugs and secret signals for communicating with smugglers. The most famous was the Red Rover, a sleek vessel that could make the journey from Calcutta to Canton in just 32 days, carrying enough opium to supply thousands of addicts. But speed wasn't enough. They needed bases of operation. Lintin Island became their headquarters, a floating warehouse anchored just outside Chinese waters. Here, British ships transferred their cargo to Chinese smuggling boats in broad daylight, protected by the claim that they were in international waters and beyond Chinese law. The operation was bold and cynical. British merchants would arrive in Canton with legal cargo, cotton, wool, manufactured goods, and conduct normal trade during the day. But at night they'd slip away to Lintin Island to oversee opium transfers to Chinese smugglers. The profits were staggering. A chest of opium that cost £30 to produce in India could be sold for £100 or more in China. With thousands of chests being smuggled every year, British merchants were making fortunes that dwarfed the wealth of European nobility. Jardine alone was worth over £1 million by the 1830s, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. But it wasn't just about individual wealth. The opium trade was becoming crucial to the British Empire's finances. The East India Company used opium profits to fund its operations in India. The British government collected taxes on opium production and export. British banks financed the trade. British ships carried the cargo. British insurance companies covered the risks. What started as a private venture was becoming a pillar of imperial policy. The merchants developed elaborate excuses for their trade. They argued they were simply meeting existing demand, not creating it. They claimed opium was no different from alcohol or tobacco, a luxury product adults could choose to use or not. They insisted Chinese addiction was due to Chinese moral weakness, not British exploitation. William Jardine famously wrote to a colleague, "We have every reason to believe that the more the Chinese consume, the better it will be for them and for us." This wasn't just cynicism. It was willful blindness to the human cost of their profits. The British merchants also lobbied their government constantly, arguing that the opium trade was essential to British interests in Asia. They painted themselves as patriots serving the empire, not drug dealers destroying lives. They funded newspapers that promoted their cause, hired lawyers to defend them, and cultivated relationships with politicians who could protect their interests. Meanwhile, American merchants were getting involved too. Companies like Russell and Company, founded by Samuel Russell, were importing Turkish opium to compete with the British product. The Americans tried to maintain respectability, claiming they were only in legitimate trade, but their ships carried just as much misery. The most disturbing part was how normal it became. By the 1830s, opium smuggling was so routine it was discussed openly in business letters, reported in newspapers, and treated as just another commodity like tea or silk. The human cost, millions of Chinese lives being destroyed, was simply ignored. The merchants developed increasingly clever methods for avoiding Chinese law enforcement. They hired Chinese compradors, local agents who handled the dangerous work of distributing drugs. They used coded language in letters, calling opium medicine or provisions. They maintained networks of safe houses, hidden warehouses, and corrupt officials. The corruption was widespread. Chinese customs officials were paid to look away. Local judges received regular bribes to avoid enforcing anti-opium laws. Even high-ranking government officials were compromised, either through direct payments or by their own addiction to the drug. The British merchants also created new marketing techniques. They offered free samples to potential customers, understanding that addiction would create permanent demand. They targeted specific groups, government workers, soldiers, students, knowing these people would spread the habit to others. They even developed different grades of opium for different social classes, from cheap, low-quality drugs for peasants to premium products for wealthy customers. The scale of the operation was breathtaking. By 1838, over 40,000 chests of opium were being smuggled into China annually. That's about 5.6 million pounds of drugs, roughly the weight of 500 elephants. The British had created the largest drug trafficking, but perhaps the most chilling part of this story is how the merchants convinced themselves they were the good guys. They saw themselves as bringing civilization to China, opening up a backward nation to the benefits of free trade. They genuinely believed that Chinese resistance to opium was evidence of Chinese ignorance and hostility to foreigners, not a legitimate attempt to protect their people from a devastating drug epidemic. This self-deception would have tragic consequences. When the Chinese government finally decided to take decisive action against the opium trade, the British merchants would cry foul, claiming they were the victims of Chinese aggression. They would demand that their government protect their legitimate business interests with military force. And their government would listen. Chapter 4: The Iron-Handed Commissioner. By 1838, the opium crisis had reached a breaking point. The Daoguang Emperor, sitting in his palace in Beijing, was finally receiving reports that made the scope of the disaster clear. His own officials were addicted. His soldiers were too drugged to fight. His treasury was being drained as silver flowed out of the country to pay for poison. Something had to be done. And the emperor knew exactly who to call. Lin Zexu, the most honest official in the empire. Lin was known as the Iron-Handed Commissioner, a man who had cleaned up corruption in every province he'd governed. If anyone could solve the opium crisis, it was him. Lin Zexu wasn't what you'd expect from an action hero. He was 54 years old, a scholar and civil servant who had spent his career studying Confucian classics and running government departments. But he had something that made him incredibly dangerous to the opium trade: he was absolutely, completely, utterly incorruptible. In a system riddled with bribery and compromise, Lin was a man who couldn't be bought, threatened, or reasoned with. When the emperor appointed him special imperial commissioner with full powers to end the opium trade, Lin knew he was taking on not just British merchants, but the entire corrupt system that had allowed the crisis to develop. He also knew that failure would mean not just the end of his career, but probably his life. Lin arrived in Canton in March 1839 like a force of nature. Within days, he had arrested over 1,700 Chinese opium dealers and confiscated thousands of pipes and other drug equipment. He ordered the execution of several major dealers as a warning to others. The message was clear: the days of tolerance were over. But Lin's real target wasn't the Chinese dealers. It was the foreign merchants who were supplying them. He issued an ultimatum to the British and American traders: surrender all your opium within 3 days, or face severe consequences. The foreign merchants were stunned. They had grown so used to Chinese officials who could be bribed or intimidated that they couldn't believe Lin was serious. They offered him money, threatened him with their government's displeasure, and tried to negotiate a compromise. Lin's response was to surround their factories with Chinese troops and cut off their food and water supplies. For 6 weeks, the foreign community was under siege. They couldn't leave their compounds, couldn't receive supplies, and couldn't communicate with their ships in the harbor. It was a masterful display of pressure without violence. Lin was forcing them to choose between their opium and their lives. Finally, Charles Elliot, the British Superintendent of Trade, made a fateful decision. He ordered all British merchants to surrender their opium to him, promising they would be compensated by the British government. He then handed over the opium to Lin, all 20,283 chests of it, worth about £2 million sterling. What happened next was one of the most dramatic moments in the history of the drug war. Instead of keeping the opium or selling it, Lin ordered its complete destruction. At a beach near the village of Human, workers constructed huge trenches lined with stone. Under Lin's personal supervision, they broke open each chest, dumped the contents into the trenches, and mixed it with salt and lime before flushing it out to sea with water. The process took 23 days. More than 500 workers labored from dawn to dusk, destroying what was then the largest stash of illegal drugs ever seized in history. British merchants watched from boats offshore, horrified to see their fortunes literally going up in smoke. But Lin wasn't finished. He wrote a remarkable letter to Queen Victoria herself, appealing to her moral character and asking her to end the opium trade. "I have heard that in your honorable country, the smoking of opium is strictly forbidden. Since it is not permitted in your own country, then even less should you let it be passed on to harm other countries. How can you bear to make profit from harming others?" The letter was never delivered. British officials intercepted it. But it revealed Lin's fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. He believed he was dealing with a rogue trade that the British government would surely stop once they understood its harmful effects. He didn't realize that the opium trade had become essential to British imperial finances, and that his actions would be seen as an act of war. Lin also began strengthening China's coastal defenses, preparing for what he feared might be British retaliation. He recruited local militias, repaired fortifications, and stockpiled weapons. But his preparations were based on traditional Chinese military thinking. He was preparing to fight the wars of the past, not understanding that warfare itself had been transformed by the Industrial Revolution. The destruction of the opium at Human was supposed to end the crisis. Lin believed he had sent a clear message that China would no longer tolerate the drug trade, and that the foreign merchants would accept Chinese law and find legitimate goods to trade. He was catastrophically wrong. When news of the opium destruction reached London, there was outrage, not at the drug dealers, but at the Chinese government for interfering with legitimate trade. Lord Palmerston, the British Foreign Secretary, declared that the Chinese must be taught that they could not injure British subjects with impunity. The British merchants, led by William Jardine, began lobbying for military action. They framed the issue not as a defense of the drug trade, but as a matter of national honor and free trade principles. They argued that British subjects had been illegally detained, their property confiscated without compensation, and their rights as free traders violated. It was a masterful propaganda campaign that transformed drug dealers into victims and turned a public health crisis into a trade dispute. The British government, already looking for an excuse to force China to open its markets, seized on the opium destruction as a reason for war. Lin Zexu, the incorruptible commissioner who had tried to save his country from a devastating drug epidemic, had unknowingly provided the British Empire with the justification it needed to go to war. The irony was bitter. In trying to protect China from opium, Lin had given the British the excuse they needed to force even more opium on his country. His moment of triumph, the destruction of 20,000 chests of drugs, would become the spark that ignited a war China could not win. As 1839 drew to a close, British warships were already sailing toward China. The First Opium War was about to begin, and with it the beginning of what the Chinese would later call their century of humiliation. Lin Zexu had fought the good fight, but he was about to learn that in the modern world, moral righteousness was no match for industrial firepower and imperial ambition. Chapter 5, When the Dragon Met the Steam Engine. The first shots of the First Opium War were fired in November 1839. But the real battle had been decided long before any soldier pulled a trigger. This wasn't going to be a war between equals. It was going to be a demonstration of what happened when a medieval military met the Industrial Revolution. The Chinese military in 1839 was essentially unchanged from what it had been centuries earlier. Chinese soldiers carried matchlock muskets that took minutes to reload, wielded swords and spears, and wore armor that might have been impressive in the Qing Dynasty but was useless against modern weapons. Their ships were traditional junks, large wooden sailing vessels that were slow, unwieldy, and armed with cannons that could barely reach half a mile. The Chinese had numbers, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of ships, and the advantage of fighting on their home territory. What they didn't have was any understanding of how warfare had changed in the age of steam and steel. The British, on the other hand, brought the cutting edge of military technology. Their secret weapon was the HMS Nemesis, an iron-hulled steamship specifically built for this war. It drew only 6 feet of water, allowing it to navigate China's shallow coastal waters and rivers. It was armed with 2 32-pounder guns that could fire explosive shells. And it could move directly against the wind, belching black smoke like some monster from Chinese nightmares. The first major engagement came at the Battle of Chuenpi in January 1841. Chinese war junks, arranged in a defensive formation, faced off against British ships in what should have been a traditional naval battle. Instead, it became a massacre. The Chinese opened fire first, their cannons booming across the water. Most of their shots fell short or bounced harmlessly off the British ships' iron hulls. In return, the British launched Congreve rockets, burly guided missiles that screamed across the water before exploding among the Chinese fleet. Then the Nemesis opened fire with its explosive shells. These weren't solid cannonballs like the Chinese were used to. They were hollow iron projectiles filled with gunpowder that exploded on impact, sending deadly fragments in all directions. One Chinese ship exploded when a shell hit its powder magazine. Another caught fire and burned to the waterline. A third was torn apart by rockets, its crew jumping overboard to drown in their heavy armor. Within an hour, the Chinese fleet was destroyed or scattered. The Nemesis was barely scratched. This pattern repeated itself along the Chinese coast. At Qinghai, British forces captured the island's fortifications in a matter of hours. At Ningbo, Chinese defenders fled before the British even landed. At Qinghai, the supposedly impregnable fortress fell in a single day. The problem wasn't Chinese courage. Their soldiers fought bravely, often to the death. The problem was that they were fighting with weapons from the 16th century against an enemy equipped with 19th century technology. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, except the knife was actually a sword and the gun was actually a cannon. The British strategy was simple but devastating: use naval power to bombard coastal defenses from a safe distance, then land troops to secure the area once resistance had been broken. The Chinese had no answer to this approach. Their coastal fortifications were designed to repel traditional attacks, not to withstand explosive shells fired from iron ships. The psychological impact was as important as the military one. Chinese soldiers had never seen ships that could move without wind, weapons that could explode after impact, or enemies who could strike from distances their own weapons couldn't reach. Many fled in panic, convinced they were fighting demons rather than men. The British moved methodically up the coast, capturing one port after another with minimal casualties. By 1842, they had reached the Yangtze River, China's great waterway and the key to the empire's heartland. British gunboats sailed up the river with impunity, demonstrating that nowhere in China was truly safe from their reach. The climax came when British forces appeared before Nanjing, the southern capital and one of China's most important cities. The message was clear: surrender or we'll march on Beijing itself. The Chinese government, finally recognizing the hopelessness of their situation, agreed to negotiate. The result was the Treaty of Nanking, signed aboard the HMS Cornwallis in August 1842. The terms were humiliating. China would pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, an astronomical sum that would bankrupt the imperial treasury. Hong Kong Island would be ceded to Britain forever. 5 ports would be open to British residents and trade. British citizens in China would no longer be subject to Chinese law, but would be governed by British courts. And though it wasn't explicitly stated in the treaty, everyone understood that the opium trade would continue unhindered. The First Opium War had lasted less than 3 years, but its impact would be felt for more than a century. China's image of itself as the center of civilization had been shattered. Its military had been exposed as obsolete. Its government had been forced to submit to barbarian demands. More importantly, the war had established a new principle in international relations, that industrial powers could use military force to open markets and impose their will on less developed nations. The Opium Wars weren't just about drugs. They were about the right of stronger nations to exploit weaker ones. For the British, the war was a complete success. They had opened Chinese markets, secured favorable trading terms, and established a permanent foothold in East Asia. The cost had been minimal, fewer than 500 British casualties, mostly from disease rather than combat. For China, the war was a catastrophe that would echo through the generations. The Qing Dynasty's mandate of heaven had been broken. The empire's borders had been violated. Its people had been forced to accept foreign domination. And the opium kept flowing. In fact, with legal protection now guaranteed by treaty, the drug trade expanded rapidly. What had been 40,000 chests per year before the war became 70,000 chests by the 1850s. The addiction that had started the crisis was now worse than ever, protected by international law and British gunboats. The dragon had met the steam engine, and the dragon had lost. The age of Chinese dominance in East Asia was over. The age of Western imperialism had begun. Chapter 6, The Second Humiliation. You might think that after the devastating defeat of the First Opium War, the Chinese would have learned their lesson and accepted British dominance. You'd be wrong. The Chinese government, still reeling from the first conflict, found itself facing an even more humiliating second war just 14 years later. The Second Opium War began in 1856 with an incident so trivial it seems almost absurd that it could spark an international conflict. Chinese officials in Canton boarded a Chinese-owned ship called the Arrow and arrested several crew members suspected of piracy. The ship was flying a British flag, probably illegally, and the British consul demanded the crew's release, claiming the vessel was under British protection. The Chinese authorities, noting that the ship was Chinese-owned and flying no flag at the time of boarding, refused. It was a minor incident, the kind of bureaucratic dispute that should have been resolved through diplomatic channels. Instead, it became the pretext for what would be an even more devastating war than the first. The British had been looking for an excuse to renegotiate the Treaty of Nanking. They wanted more ports opened, deeper access to China's interior, and most importantly, the complete legalization of the opium trade. The Arrow incident gave them the justification they needed. But this time, they wouldn't be fighting alone. The French joined the conflict after a French missionary was executed in Guangxi province. Two industrial powers against one crumbling empire. The outcome was never in doubt. The Second Opium War was even more one-sided than the first. British and French forces easily overwhelmed Chinese defenses, capturing Canton and forcing the Chinese government to flee Beijing. But the most shocking moment came in October 1860, when British forces committed an act of cultural vandalism that would scar the Chinese psyche forever. The old summer palace, known as Yuanmingyuan, was the crown jewel of Chinese architecture and art. Built over 150 years, it was a vast complex of exquisite buildings, gardens, and priceless artifacts. It was China's Versailles, its Vatican, its Louvre, all rolled into one magnificent testament to Chinese civilization. When Chinese negotiators captured and tortured British envoys during peace talks, Lord Elgin, son of the man who took the Elgin marbles from Greece, ordered the palace's complete destruction as punishment. For 3 days, British and French troops systematically looted everything of value, then burned the rest to the ground. A French officer who witnessed the destruction wrote, "You could walk only on precious objects. It was necessary to walk over porcelain, bronzes, rich stuffs, precious stones." 2 centuries of Chinese cultural heritage went up in flames in a deliberate act of cultural terrorism. The psychological impact was devastating. This wasn't just military defeat. It was a direct attack on Chinese civilization itself. The message was clear: even China's greatest cultural achievements were not worthy of respect or preservation. The treaties that ended the Second Opium War were even harsher than those that concluded the first. The Treaty of Tianjin and the Convention of Peking opened 10 more ports to foreign trade. Allowed foreigners to travel freely in China's interior. Gave Christian missionaries protection for their activities. Explicitly legalized the opium trade. Imposed another crushing indemnity. Perhaps most symbolically painful, foreign diplomats gained the right to reside in Beijing itself, the sacred capital that had been largely closed to barbarians for centuries. The Son of Heaven would now have to receive representatives of foreign powers as equals, a final rejection of the tributary system that had placed China at the center of its world. By 1860, China had been transformed from a proud, independent empire into what historians call a semi-colonial state. Foreign powers controlled its ports, dictated its trade policies, and could use military force to enforce their will. The opium that had started as a smuggling problem was now a legal trade protected by international treaties. The human cost was staggering. Opium addiction had spread throughout Chinese society, from the imperial court to the humblest peasant village. Entire regions were economically devastated as people chose drugs over food, opium over work. The social fabric that had held Chinese civilization together for millennia was unraveling. The Qing Dynasty, once the most powerful government on earth, was now a hollow shell. Its military was obsolete, its treasury empty, its authority undermined by foreign interference. The emperor still sat on the dragon throne, but real power lay with the foreign consuls and merchants who dictated China's policies from their comfortable compounds in the treaty ports. The opium trade, now legal and protected, exploded to unprecedented levels. By the 1880s, China was importing over 80,000 chests of opium annually, more than 11 million pounds of drugs flooding into the country every year. Domestic production had also begun, as Chinese farmers, seeing the profits to be made, started growing poppies themselves. The irony was bitter. The Chinese government, having failed to keep foreign opium out, now found itself taxing domestic opium production to raise revenue. The drug that had been banned as a threat to Chinese society was now a source of government income. The Second Opium War marked the point of no return for imperial China. The First War had been a shock, a wake-up call that could potentially have led to reform and modernization. The Second War was a death sentence, a demonstration that China was helpless before Western industrial power. The psychological trauma ran deep. Chinese intellectuals began to question everything, their government, their culture, their entire way of life. If the Middle Kingdom could be so easily defeated by barbarians, what did that say about Chinese civilization? If Confucian values and traditional learning were powerless against Western guns and ships, what was the point of preserving them? This crisis of confidence would plague China for the next century. The country that had once seen itself as the center of the world now saw itself as the sick man of Asia, weak, divided, and at the mercy of foreign powers. The Opium Wars had achieved something that no previous invasion or rebellion had managed. They had broken China's spirit. The dragon had not just been defeated. It had been humiliated, carved up, and forced to participate in its own destruction. And still, the opium kept flowing. Chapter 7, The Empire Falls Apart. The aftermath of the Opium Wars was like watching a slow-motion collapse of one of history's greatest civilizations. China in the 1860s and 1870s was a country in free fall, battered by foreign aggression, internal rebellion, and the ongoing devastation of mass drug addiction. The most immediate consequence was the complete breakdown of the traditional Chinese economy. For centuries, China had operated on a silver standard, its currency was backed by precious metal that flowed in from trade with the outside world. But now that silver was flowing out to pay for opium, and the entire monetary system collapsed. Imagine if the US dollar suddenly lost half its value in just a few years. That's what the Chinese were experiencing. Prices soared, wages plummeted, and ordinary people found themselves unable to afford basic necessities. The government, already struggling to pay the massive indemnities imposed by the Western powers, found it increasingly difficult to collect taxes from an impoverished population. The social impact was even more devastating. Opium addiction had spread from the coastal cities deep into China's interior. In some villages, entire populations were addicted. Fields lay fallow because farmers were too drugged to work. Workshops sat empty because craftsmen had sold their tools to buy opium. The family, the foundation of Chinese life for centuries, began to crumble from within. Parents who once worked tirelessly for their children now found themselves trading away the small comforts of the household just to satisfy their cravings. A father might quietly sell the tools he relied on to feed his family. A mother might part with the few treasured possessions she had, a silver hairpin, a jade bracelet, telling herself it was only this once. Meanwhile, their children waited for meals that never came, watching the warmth of family life seep away as addiction hollowed out the people they depended on most. The government's response was pathetic and contradictory. Officials who weren't themselves addicted to opium were often corrupt, taking bribes from drug dealers while publicly condemning the trade. Those who tried to enforce anti-opium laws found themselves fighting not just foreign merchants, but their own subordinates, many of whom were either addicted or profiting from the trade. The Qing Dynasty's legitimacy, already damaged by military defeat, was further undermined by its inability to protect its people from what was obviously a foreign-imposed plague. The mandate of heaven, the traditional justification for imperial rule, required the emperor to maintain harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. Mass drug addiction was hardly harmonious. This crisis of legitimacy sparked a series of devastating rebellions that would claim tens of millions of lives. The most destructive was the Taiping Rebellion, led by Hong Xiuquan, a failed scholar who became convinced he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to rid China of both the Manchu demons, who ruled as the Qing Dynasty, and the foreign devils, who pushed their opium and religion. The Taiping Rebellion lasted from 1850 to 1864 and was the deadliest civil war in human history, claiming an estimated 20 to 30 million lives. It was directly connected to the opium crisis. Hong's movement gained support precisely because the Qing government had proven unable to protect China from foreign exploitation. But the Taiping Rebellion was just one of many uprisings that rocked China in the aftermath of the Opium Wars. The Nian Rebellion in the north, the Muslim rebellions in the southwest, the small sword society in Shanghai, all reflected the weakening grip of a dynasty that had lost the mandate of heaven in the eyes of many of its subjects. Meanwhile, the Western powers continued to carve up China like a melon. Russia seized vast territories in the north. Germany claimed Shandong province. France took control of parts of the southwest. Britain expanded from Hong Kong into the new territories. Each new concession further weakened Chinese sovereignty and demonstrated the government's helplessness. The most humiliating moment came in 1900 with the Boxer Rebellion, when rural militias rose up against foreign influence, particularly missionaries. Initially supported by the Qing court under Empress Dowager Cixi, the rebellion became yet another disaster when a multinational force of 20,000 troops from 8 nations crushed the poorly armed Boxers and occupied Beijing. The resulting Boxer Protocol of 1901 forced China to pay yet another crippling indemnity, 450 million taels of silver, more than the government's annual revenue, to be paid over 39 years with interest. Foreign troops gained the right to be permanently stationed in Beijing. The final humiliation of the once mighty empire was complete. By this point, opium had become so entrenched in Chinese society that the government had given up trying to ban it. Instead, they began taxing it as a source of revenue. The drug that had been condemned as a threat to Chinese civilization was now helping to fund what remained of the Chinese state. Domestic opium production had also exploded. Chinese farmers, seeing the profits to be made, began growing poppies on a massive scale. By the end of the 19th century, China was producing 85% of the opium consumed within its borders. The country had become not just a victim of the drug trade, but a participant in it. The intellectual and cultural impact was equally profound. Chinese scholars and reformers began to question everything about their civilization. If China could be so easily defeated by Western barbarians, what did that say about Chinese culture, Chinese values, Chinese learning? Some, like the reformer Kang Youwei, argued for gradual modernization while preserving Chinese essence. Others, like the revolutionary Sun Yat-sen, called for the complete overthrow of the imperial system and the creation of a modern republic. Still others, overwhelmed by the scale of China's humiliation, retreated into nostalgia for a golden age. The Opium Wars had done more than defeat China militarily. They had shattered Chinese confidence in their own civilization. The country that had once seen itself as the center of the world now saw itself as backward, weak, and inferior to the West. This psychological trauma would shape Chinese thinking for the next century and beyond. The determination to never again be humiliated by foreign powers would drive Chinese policy through the Republican period, the Communist Revolution, and into the modern era. The Qing Dynasty limped on until 1911, when the Xinhai Revolution finally ended over 2,000 years of imperial rule. The last emperor, Puyi, was just 6 years old when he abdicated. The empire that had once controlled a third of the world's wealth had collapsed, brought down by a flower and the greed of foreign merchants. But the legacy of the Opium Wars lived on. The treaties signed under duress, the territorial concessions, the principle that China could be forced to accept foreign domination, all of this would continue to shape China's relationship with the outside world long after the last emperor had left the Forbidden City. The dragon had fallen, and it would take more than a century for it to rise again. Chapter 8, Lessons from the Ashes. As we reach the end of our journey through this dark chapter of history, it's important to understand that the Opium Wars didn't just end with treaties and territorial concessions. Their impact echoed through the next century and continues to shape China's worldview today. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The new Republic of China, established in 1912, inherited a country devastated by addiction, divided by foreign spheres of influence, and traumatized by a century of humiliation. The Republican government struggled to unite the country and resist Japanese aggression, all while dealing with the ongoing opium crisis. Even as late as the 1930s, opium remained a massive problem in China. Warlords grew rich from taxing the trade. The Japanese, during their occupation of Manchuria and later much of eastern China, actively promoted opium addiction as a way of weakening Chinese resistance. Government efforts to suppress the drug competed with the need for revenue and the reality of widespread corruption. It wasn't until the communist victory in 1949 that China finally managed to effectively end the opium epidemic that had begun with those British merchant ships in the early 19th century. Through harsh suppression, mass treatment programs, and fundamental social reorganization, the People's Republic accomplished what the Qing Dynasty could not, the elimination of widespread opium addiction. But the psychological scars remained. The century of humiliation became a foundational narrative in modern Chinese identity, taught in schools, referenced in speeches, and embedded in the national consciousness. The lesson drawn was clear and stark: weakness invites aggression. China must never again be vulnerable to foreign powers. This brings us back to where we began. A nation that once dominated world trade, that considered itself the center of civilization, that needed nothing from barbarian states, was brought low not primarily by military defeat, but by a flower, by a drug that weakened it from within while creating the very crisis that led to external intervention. The British writer Samuel Taylor Coleridge, himself an opium addict, once wrote of a stately pleasure dome in Xanadu, ancient China, where Ulf, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. His poem captures something of opium's allure, the beautiful dreams that lead to darkness. For China, opium created not pleasure domes but national catastrophe. The sacred rivers of its civilization ran down to a sunless sea of addiction, humiliation, and decline. The celestial empire descended into a century of darkness from which it has only recently begun to emerge. The story of the Opium Wars reminds us of human frailty, our vulnerability to addiction, whether to substances, power, or wealth. It shows how systems can fail gradually, almost imperceptibly, until suddenly the structures that seemed eternal crumble before our eyes. But it also contains hope. China, after a century of struggle, has reclaimed its sovereignty and rebuilt its strength. The nation that once fell to opium has risen again, becoming once more a major power on the world stage. Perhaps that's the final lesson of this dark historical tale: empires fall, nations suffer, but people endure. They learn, they rebuild, and sometimes they even forgive, though they never forget. The weight of history is heavy, but it need not be crushing. The Opium Wars were a tragedy, but they were not the end of China's story. They were a chapter, a dark and painful chapter, in the long history of a civilization that has survived invasions, rebellions, famines, and foreign domination. Today, as we face our own challenges with addiction, with the abuse of power, with the exploitation of the weak by the strong, the story of the Opium Wars offers both warning and wisdom. It reminds us that no nation, no matter how powerful, is immune to the consequences of moral failure. It shows us that the pursuit of profit without regard for human cost leads inevitably to tragedy. But it also demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for recovery and renewal, and the possibility that even the darkest chapters can eventually give way to new beginnings. The echoes of the Opium Wars still reverberate today in ways both obvious and subtle. When Chinese leaders speak of national rejuvenation, when they emphasize sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs, when they approach international relations with a mixture of confidence and wariness, they are responding to lessons learned during those dark decades of the 19th century. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's massive infrastructure project spanning continents, can be seen as an attempt to reverse the historical flow of exploitation, to be the one building ports and railways in other countries rather than having foreign powers carve up Chinese territory. The emphasis on win-win cooperation reflects a conscious rejection of the zero-sum imperialism that once devastated China. Even China's approach to drug policy bears the mark of this history. The country maintains some of the world's harshest penalties for drug trafficking, executing more drug dealers annually than the rest of the world combined. This isn't just about public health, it's about national security, rooted in the understanding that drugs can be weapons used to destroy societies from within. The irony is that today it's often Chinese-made fentanyl that's devastating communities in America and Europe, creating addiction crises that echo China's own historical trauma. The wheel of history has turned, but the fundamental dynamics remain the same: the powerful exploit the weak, addiction destroys lives, and the consequences ripple across generations. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Opium Wars is about the danger of cultural arrogance and the importance of adaptation. The Qing Dynasty's initial response to Western pressure was to retreat into isolation and tradition, convinced that Chinese civilization was superior and that the barbarians would eventually go away. This attitude, while understandable, proved catastrophic when faced with the realities of industrial-age power. The Chinese eventually learned to adapt, to borrow what was useful from foreign cultures while maintaining their own identity. The process was painful and took more than a century, but it ultimately allowed China to reclaim its place as a major world power. The lesson applies not just to nations, but to individuals and organizations. The ability to learn, adapt, and change is essential for survival in a rapidly evolving world. As we close this long journey through one of history's most tragic conflicts, it's worth reflecting on what it means for us today. We live in an interconnected world where the actions of one nation can have profound consequences for others. The drugs that destroyed Chinese society in the 19th century were produced in British-controlled India and sold by British merchants, but the addiction and suffering were experienced by Chinese families. Today's global challenges, climate change, pandemics, economic inequality, the spread of misinformation, require the same kind of international cooperation that was so tragically absent during the Opium Wars. The alternative is a world where the strong continue to exploit the weak, where short-term profits take precedence over long-term consequences, and where the cycle of exploitation and revenge continues to turn. The story of the Opium Wars is ultimately a story about choices. The choice to prioritize profit over human welfare. The choice to use force rather than negotiation. The choice to exploit rather than cooperate. These same choices face us today in different forms, and the lessons of history can guide us toward better decisions. As the night deepens and your eyelids grow heavy, let the weight of this history settle gently into your consciousness. The Opium Wars were not just about China and Britain, not just about the 19th century, not just about drugs and trade. They were about fundamental questions of power, morality, and human nature that remain relevant today. The poppy fields of Afghanistan still produce opium that flows into the veins of addicts around the world. Pharmaceutical companies still push addictive drugs while downplaying their dangers. Powerful nations still use economic pressure to force weaker countries to accept unfavorable terms. The specific details change, but the underlying patterns persist. Yet there is also hope in this story. China's recovery from its century of humiliation shows that even the most devastating defeats need not be permanent. Nations can learn, adapt, and rebuild. Civilizations can survive their darkest hours and emerge stronger. The human capacity for resilience, for learning from mistakes, for choosing cooperation over conflict, remains our greatest asset in facing the challenges of our own time. The last opium den in China closed decades ago. The foreign concessions have been returned to Chinese control. The unequal treaties have been abrogated. The dragon has risen again, not through conquest or revenge, but through the patient work of rebuilding, reforming, and rejoining the community of nations as an equal partner. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without cost. Millions died in wars, revolutions, and famines during China's long struggle to regain its strength and dignity. But the ultimate victory was not military or economic. It was moral and spiritual. China proved that a nation could overcome even the most devastating humiliation and reclaim its rightful place in the world. As you drift towards sleep, carried by the gentle rhythm of your breathing and the soft sounds of the night, remember that history is not just about the past. It's about the future we choose to create. The lessons of the Opium Wars, painful as they are, can help us build a world where such tragedies need not be repeated. The flower that once brought down an empire still blooms in fields around the world. But its power to destroy need not be absolute. Human wisdom, human compassion, and human cooperation can overcome even the darkest chapters of our shared history. Sleep now, knowing that you've witnessed one of history's great tragedies and triumphs, the fall and rise of a civilization, the power of a plant to change the world, and the ultimate resilience of the human spirit. The story is complete. The lessons learned. And tomorrow brings new opportunities to apply that wisdom in our own lives and times. The night is peaceful. The history is told. And the future remains unwritten. Rest well in the knowledge that understanding the past helps us navigate the present and build a better tomorrow. The Opium Wars are over, but their lessons live on, guiding us toward a world where strength serves justice, where power protects the vulnerable, and where the mistakes of the past light the way to a brighter future. Sweet dreams, and may you wake refreshed and ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow may bring.